The Tsantsa tribe made real mummies from the heads of deceased people, and in the Zuni tribe, little boys were beaten with whips and switches. In this video, I'll tell you about the lives of the indigenous people of America, their customs, and what happened to the modern Indians. And at the end of the video, you'll learn about the most terrifying and amazing rituals that existed in the culture of the indigenous people. Enjoy watching. Today, the territory of North and South America can be characterized as a place where some of the most advanced technologies in the world are concentrated. Just look at the United States of America alone, the world's leading economy, huge military potential, the best technologies. A country that is a leader in many aspects of our modern society's life, but few know that some 600 or 700 years ago, the people who inhabited those lands led a primitive way of life. But there were those who were almost indistinguishable in terms of development level from advanced European countries. And it is precisely about all these tribes what I want to tell you. Indigenous peoples of America are called all those people who inhabited these lands before the arrival of colonizers in the 15th century. And their diversity personally greatly impresses me. The thing is, all these people lived completely differently. Some delved into agriculture, some groups spent more time fishing and aquaculture, and some tribes lived off hunting and gathering. There were even those peoples who lived by warring with all other aborigines, thereby finding sustenance for themselves. In general, there were many indigenous peoples of America, and they all differed in their culture and traditions. But separately, I'd like to highlight that many tribes were quite well developed. For example, there were communities that had knowledge in the field of engineering, architecture, mathematics, astronomy, and even physics. And that's not to mention the most basic survival skills and knowledge, so those who claim that there were no educated indigenous people in the territory of America are absolutely wrong. As I already mentioned, many peoples were engaged in agriculture. And at this point, it is worth paying special attention because the knowledge of the indigenous peoples of America has reached our days. The fact is that the natives extensively used corn in their cuisine. It may seem like the most ordinary product that anyone can afford today, but just 5 centuries ago, no one knew about this wonderful plant at all. It was the tribes of America who paid a lot of attention to growing his agricultural crop. Therefore, dishes containing this product were widely used in the culture of the Indians. And the first colonizers were very surprised by the new plant and the dishes that were prepared using it. So, the widespread use of corn in the United States and subsequently in Europe and the rest of the world began precisely with the experience of the Indians. In addition to this wonderful plant, Native Americans used pumpkins, onions, cabbage, and even cacti during cooking. True, these products, specifically the natives, mainly collected in the wild. But it is also noteworthy that Indians loved to make infusions in various teas. In general, they paid a lot of attention to herbs. And I'd like to give them credit, modern society and culture owe a lot to indigenous people of America in terms of tea drinking. I just love sweet popcorn and boiled corn. And you? In general, it can be noted that the indigenous tribes of America cooked quite well. For example, one of the dishes that the Lakota natives cooked. The recipe, by the way, was passed down from generation to generation, and this is called vasna. It's consisted of dried buffalo meat, dried berries, as well as fat or bone marrow. In general, it was an extremely nutritious dish that contained a lot of protein and fat. But the main thing is that for this dish, all the ingredients were ground. And vasna was also used as a healing tool. In general, it was extremely useful food. Why was it so attractive to local residents? It's all about its composition. Did you know that buffalo meat contains much more protein than beef? And this despite the fact that it has less fat? And it also has one wonderful protein that has very cool properties. Thanks to it, the level of iron in our body rises. These properties helped a lot in the fight against various diseases. Those tribes that did not engage in agriculture but lived off hunting and gathering ate anything at all, and here is one very sad fact that personally saddened and horrified me. Aborigines living in South America ate guinea pigs. Yes, those cute little animals. In general, there were tribes that bred them to use as food, and there were those that caught wild individuals. And in those regions where fishing was developed, they cooked the famous fish soup called pira caldo. It included, as you might have guessed, fish, namely catfish, fresh vegetables, greens, and even cream cheese. Agree, even now this dish sounds very tasty, and now imagine that it was cooked several hundred years ago. In my narrative about the indigenous inhabitants of America, I cannot but highlight the housing of the Aborigines. You probably, like me, have the impression that all Indians lived in wigwams. Indeed, in cinema, movies, and even computer games, indigenous peoples are attributed to this type of housing. But in reality, the Aborigines had completely different types of homes. For example, the famous Iroquois tribe lived in very unusual structures. The thing is, the houses were very long. Their length reached up to 90 meters. At the same time, the width of such a house was all about 10 meters. In general, it was the most ordinary residential house at that time, built of wood. Typically, families from one large clan lived in it, so all the residents were relatives to each other. These long houses were so huge that only 3 buildings were needed to form a full-fledged village. And for example, the Cherokee, who, like the Iroquois, led a settled way of life, built houses separately for each family. Built at the same time, they lived in areas where there was a lot of clay, so their houses were very different. The walls were made, as you might have guessed, from clay, and the roof was made of straw or tree bark. The Cherokee village consisted of approximately 30 or 40 such houses. The Navajo tribe also built houses from clay, however, they had their own special feature. They erected simple and underground dwellings. Yes, you heard right, the same type of housing that is usually built in places with harsh winters. The walls and roof were made of logs covered with clay, and at the same time, very few materials were needed because the soil already served as the floor and part of the walls. So who actually lived in the famous wigwams? It was the tribes that led a nomadic way of life. After all, it was important for them to quickly set up and also quickly remove their housing. Moreover, more often than not, wigwams were built by those Aborigines who inhabited forests. So, don't think that all Indians were cave dwellers.
We don't live in wigwams or clay huts anymore. We have comfortable homes and cars. Nowadays, living is a bit safer. You won't be attacked by wild animals or die from the cold. But there are still risks. What if you're in a car accident in modern America? Where do you turn for help? Where can you find a competent lawyer? How do you get compensation if you don't have insurance? The DTP America company has helped its clients receive $21 million in compensation. Here, they will definitely answer all your questions. Link in the description.
Label number 6, religion. And next, I'd like to tell you about what the indigenous peoples of America believed in. The thing is, this is an extremely interesting topic. Why, you might ask me? Well, because many peoples had a very interesting tradition, which I'll tell you about separately a little later. So what did the Native Americans believe in? The religion of these peoples, as you might have guessed, was completely different, just like their other customs. The main role here was played by the way of life of the Aborigines, but they were united by one thing. Almost all indigenous people used totems. What are they? Totems are figurines that represent creatures possessing magical powers. For example, the peoples engaged in agriculture were divided into cults. Some worshipped the sun, others worshipped individual plants, for example corn, and still, others worshipped tobacco. As you might have guessed, there were many tribes, so their cultures constantly intertwined. And the same Aborigines who engaged in hunting could worship gods of fertility, and in general, this is a separate and very interesting topic. If you want me to tell you in detail about the most interesting religions of Native American tribes, then write about it in the comments and then I'll make a separate video. And what about the interesting customs and rituals that I promised to tell you about? Especially for you, I found a very eerie and terrifying custom. The Tsantsa tribe, which lived in the territory of modern Peru and Ecuador, dried the heads of the deceased. Why did they do this? The Tsantsa believed that this way they captured the soul of the deceased and sealed it in such a strange object. Well, how they made such heads is horrifying. They filled the severed head with hot sand, which was preheated on a fire in a clay bowl. When it cooled down, it was heated again. At the same time, the master making the trophy was constantly watching the face of the deceased. After all, it had to resemble the person when they were alive. As a result of all these experiments, the head decreased in size and became very hard. There were also more peaceful customs and rituals. For example, in the Zaparo tribe, people believed that animals could transmit some supernatural power. What did this mean? Well, that the men of this tribe never ate the meat of slow-moving animals before battle because they believed that such a property was passed on to them. On the contrary, they preferred to feast on the meat of jaguars, monkeys, or even wild dogs before battle. But in the Zuni tribe, there were not such pleasant customs as eating meat. These aborigines believed in purification through whipping and lashes. All boys aged 5 to 9 had to undergo a special ritual. Other members of the tribe would wear frightening masks and then beat the boys with switches. This ritual was conducted twice. The first time at a very young age, and the second at 12 years old. Just at that moment when it was necessary to choose the boy's further life path. I found an even stranger custom. In the Shoshone tribe, there was a special ritual that was carried out with all pregnant women. Don't worry, no one was beaten with whips or mocked, everything was a little different, although less strange. Pregnant women had to settle far away from the main village in a separate wigwam, which was built within throwing distance of a stone. Expectant mothers drank only cold water and ate roots. There was no talk of normal food, and girls were not allowed to touch their heads. At the same time, the future father followed the same diet, but in addition to this, he had to get up earlier than everyone else and run a long distance. What's the idea behind such a strange tradition? Well, the Shoshone believed that if a woman ate normal food, then the child would grow up fat and lazy, and the father was chased to endure part of the suffering of his wife. In short, these Shoshone were strange, but as it seems to me, their customs were quite adequate. What do you think? Which of all the rituals that I mentioned are the strangest? Well, it's time to move on to the sad part of the video. What actually happened to all these tribes? Spoiler alert, almost all of them were annihilated. The thing is, European colonizers, when they realized that they had arrived in new lands that belonged to no one, began to seize them. The level of development of most indigenous tribes was very far from that of advanced Europeans. Naturally, they stood no chance in an unequal battle. Therefore, many tribes were literally exterminated and destroyed. The war between the Indians and the Europeans lasted a very long time. Local residents were systematically oppressed. For example, they were simply driven off fertile lands, and those who disagreed were simply killed. It was a genuine genocide, which at that time was considered normal. Some of the Aborigines fell into slavery and were forced to work on hard labor for their entire lives. In general, terrible things were happening, which saddened me greatly. But fortunately, many of the peoples were able to survive this difficult period. Some tribes began to assimilate into the rapidly changing world and started living together with the incoming colonizers. However, they were still oppressed, their rituals were forbidden, and all their customs were considered something wild. But even so, many of the local residents managed to assimilate and start anew. Today, there are very few representatives of Native American tribes left. They've lost their unique distinguishing features, many traditions have been lost, and they have all become ordinary people. However, even now many of them suffer from persecution in America. There is even a very sad statistic that shows that the average income of Native Americans is much lower than that of all other social groups. But even so, in America, there are now special charitable funds that are engaged in the protection and support of indigenous people. However, I wouldn't say that they do it successfully. After all, even now there are nationalists who speak directly to Native American women, saying that if it weren't for modern laws, they would have raped and killed on the spot. In general, all these horrors that were committed against the indigenous population of America have not disappeared anywhere, and I've already talked about this in one of my previous videos. Today, we have thoroughly examined the life and customs of the indigenous population of America, as well as touched upon the very important topic of persecution in modern society of the descendants of those very peoples. What do you think? Will we ever be able to overcome all these problems? Write about it in the comments, and thank you for watching.